Hello everybody. Welcome back. Today we're gonna talk about a very interesting topic, equanimity, but from two different perspectives, two types of equanimity. The query of the day before I get started is, what is it like to be an octopus? They have 8 tentacles, and all of them have tiny little suction cups. The phenomenology of that must be very interesting. Um, is it relatable in any way to what we experience? I would say yes, because on a normal day to day state of consciousness, our attention streams are divided and fragmented, almost kind of like tentacles. You're talking to somebody at a very busy party. I would argue there's maybe kind of like three or so attentional clusters that are kind of like hovering around you and the conversation. But then there's kind of these other tentacles that are scouting around for, dangers, threats, opportunities, funny things, or the food platter, things like that. So I think our default state of consciousness is already kind of like an octopus when it comes to our attentional streams. And, jhana practice, concentration practice, unifies those attention streams and turns them into just one. This property of the state of consciousness of the jhanas, they called ekagata, which is one thing at a time, or kind of like the one thing focused mind, not necessarily single pointed, because when you concentrate on one point, it can be very tense. Actually, you need some kind of like tension to really focus on just one point. But you can have ekagata, you can have this unity of your attentional streams in a very soft and distributed fashion. That's totally fine. Okay, so getting specifically to the topic of the day, I was listening again to Practising the Jhanas by Rob Burbea, a lecture series that I highly recommend, which was created when he was about to die, essentially. He decided to give one last retreat and, of course, record everything in multiple ways and teach the jhanas, which are these very highly concentrated states of consciousness that are very pleasant, beautiful, healing, and beneficial across the board. Just gonna list them very quickly, which is the first one is body pleasure, kind of bubbly, pleasant sensations, vibrations in the blood vessels, all sorts of things like that. The second one is happiness, absorption into happiness, joy, but it mixes with the body pleasure. It's actually kind of a mixed hybrid state, actually. Then the third jhana is peace, just like very, very alien type of peace, very delicate and beautiful peace. Then the fourth one is, named equanimity, which is kind of this sense of stillness and complete acceptance to whatever is. Then the fifth one is, the sphere of infinite space or boundless space where there's nothing but space. Then the sixth one is infinite consciousness or boundless consciousness, where the object of your attention, in a kind of single pointed way, not in the geometric sense of a point, but in the sense of only one thing at a time, is the sense of consciousness, of awareness, of witnessing. Then the seventh is nothingness. Nothingness is the content of your experience in that state of consciousness. And the last one is neither something nor nothing, which is a very rarefied, very, 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 very rare, also very thin state of consciousness. Almost completely blank, but not quite. So, listening to the fourth jhana lecture in particular, it really struck me that the way in which Rob Burbea talks about equanimity is not quite the same as the way in which Shinzen Young talks about equanimity. For context, Shinzen Young has a very scientific approach to meditation. He's in his 80s. He's actually right now doing research with ultrasound stimulation to maximize equanimity and accelerate meditation practice. He wrote a wonderful book called The Science of Enlightenment that I highly recommend reading. Rob Burbea, on the other hand, he died recently, fairly young, unfortunately, Um, and he wrote a fantastic book called Seeing That Frees. I think they're both amazing. Okay, they're really top-notch teachers, and I love it because they really try to improve upon traditional frameworks and use their intelligence. Shinzen Young will encourage you to, yes, try to make this consistent with science. Try to figure out in what way science can be compatible and synergize, with meditation practice. Rob Burbea will kind of not necessarily science per se, but he does tell you use your intelligence. Don't just take meditation practice as kind of a ritual or a recipe. Actually figure out what is it that is happening in your body when you do, metta practice, something like may all be happy or may I be happy. Like, what is happening? Notice the resonances. Treat it as a kind of like a puzzle where you put phrases and attentional modes exactly in the right moment where you can increase the energy and the spark of your state of consciousness. And I love that. It's like, use your intelligence. Use your intelligence in meditation. It's a very different aesthetic. Okay, so Shinzen Young really emphasizes equanimity a lot. Now, Rob Burbea, he cares a lot about equanimity, but he doesn't make that big of a deal of it. So what I'm going to do is briefly explain in what way I understand their approach to equanimity, and then I'm going to explain kind of the QRI, Quality Research Institute, take on what that equanimity means, depending on, who am I talking about. So first, Shinzen Young style of equanimity is really centered on this idea that there is something like an equation for suffering. And the equation for suffering is along the lines of suffering equals pain times resistance. As a consequence, you have a lot of pain but very little resistance. If you don't resist the sensations, you just let them be, then your suffering may be close to zero. In fact, if your resistance entirely goes away, then in that framework, your suffering completely disappears, even though you may have an enormous amount of pain. There's a lot of caveats to this framework, actually, because I think suffering ultimately comes down to negative valence, and pain is a specific type of negative valence. So wherever there is pain, there's always a little bit of suffering. However, the act of resisting and kind of like blocking the sensations from the rest of your body, or trying to ignore them or distract yourself from them, over time do build up some kind of tension in your being, and kind of like a little bit of a sense of dissociation from your body, because you're not actually paying attention to the low level sensations and you're not trying to integrate them. Now, it is not the case that you can kind of just walk up to somebody and say, okay, now just don't resist at all. I'm going to apply a very painful sensation to you and you will see how you don't experience any suffering, because most of our resistance is actually subconscious. It takes a while for kind of the attitude of just accept whatever is to get propagated to the deeper layers of your subconscious and your being. One example of like a very good kind of equanimity practice actually is something like taking cold showers without either stalling or flinching, right? You don't want either of those two. If you can successfully do that, you can just, okay, it's warm water. I'm just going to turn on the cold water and, okay, these are just some sensations, and you're not tensing. You're not kind of like waiting. You're not trying to avoid it. You're just letting it happen, for 30 seconds, for 1 minute, just something like that. That is great equanimity practice. And that is very much what Shinzen Young is talking about. Now, from the point of view of QRI, my interpretation of what is it that you're doing when you practice that type of equanimity is that you are increasing the stress dissipation capacity of different facets of your being. Very similar to how computing systems have cooling engines. You may have like a very, very powerful processor, and then you have kind of this cooling device, these like columns of metal that dissipate the heat. Well, simulations show that just having columns, of metal is not the most efficient way of dissipating heat. The most efficient way is to have actually kind of this tentacular structure, indeed something's kind of like fractal and it branches out and maximizes the surface area. That is something that really reduces the like how high the temperature is. It dissipates the heat faster. So my interpretation of Shinzen Young style of equanimity is that you're building up these intense kind of like energies in your body, resonances and vibrations, and then by not resisting, you're allowing your kind of central hub of experience to function as an intelligent rerouting system for different parts of your body to help dissipate the stress in other parts of the body. This is phenomenologically quite accessible, and I recommend paying attention to this. That, okay, yes, you have like an unpleasant discomfort in your chest or in your leg, and notice how when you approach it with complete equanimity and you just feel it without judging it and without resisting, that stress will find somewhere else in your body to connect and resonate with in such a way that that other region will kind of like function as a stress dissipator or a heat dissipator, a heat sink in a way. And my understanding, based on my own experience of doing these practices, is that over time, your whole being actually becomes kind of this efficient stress dissipator, where the more you expose yourself to different types of stresses, maybe at a high level, but not enough to actually traumatize you or cause irreversible damage, of course, you will be building these kind of like super highways inside you that increase the stress dissipation capacity of your system. Okay, that is Shinzen Young, right? Now, this type of equanimity is quite universally applicable to, so many contexts. You're very, distracted multitasking, you can apply this equanimity. You're, doing single-pointed meditation, you can apply this equanimity. You're eating hot peppers, you can apply this equanimity. You're delivering a speech without preparing, you can apply this type of equanimity. It's very powerful and very, very, very general. And even when you notice, oh my gosh, I'm still resisting, I'm not able to apply equanimity, well, he will say you can always apply second-order equanimity, which is equanimity about your absence of equanimity. And if you do this diligently, eventually the second-order equanimity starts to become first-order equanimity, and then you actually have the equanimity. Again, it's something that takes practice, so don't expect immediate results. But if you do a practice like this and approach life with as little resistance as possible, in general, you will notice that your capacity to dissipate stress and actually having a good time will increase. Now, the Rob Burbea style of equanimity is, I think, quite different, and actually he really discusses it in the context of the fourth jhana. And here's where it's very, very confusing, actually. And I think to some extent why maybe I wasn't making that much progress on that particular jhana practice, because I was kind of really just thinking from a Shinzen Young style of equanimity. But Rob Burbea makes the observation that based on different translations of the original texts, he argues that a better term would actually be stillness. That the thing that you are concentrating on, the object of concentration within the single kind of pointedness of your consciousness, the single one bucket of attention that you have, is stillness. Okay, so in the earlier jhanas, you're focusing on things such as, oh yes, these bubbly, pleasant sensations, first jhana, right? Or wow, this kind of like energy of joy that comes up, okay, second jhana, right? Or, oh, this very beautiful peace, so peaceful and relaxing, just everything quieting down, third jhana. So it was kind of confusing to me. It's like, okay, so now do I apply kind of that, but for just the act of not resisting exactly? Well, not really. Instead, what I would recommend is to apply that kind of approach, that concentration, because remember, whatever you concentrate on gets stronger, is stillness. So as you go from the third jhana, just focusing on peace, you can slowly move towards, okay, what is the most still, the part that is moving the least in all of your field of consciousness, and use that as kind of your reference point. Now, I think to make progress here, you have to recognize that any aspect of your sensate world is subject to change, right? It's impermanent, it's constantly changing, it's constantly bubbling up, it's dynamic. So you actually need to create your own configuration of the field of consciousness where stillness is emergent and kind of become that. Okay, so the QRI interpretation of these, okay, this is where it gets really wild, because one of the things that I've been talking about for some years now, and I'm currently running simulations on and trying to make genuine progress in this theory, is what it feels like to be a moment of experience, what it feels like to be a topological pocket in the fields of physics, is the superposition of all possible points of view within that pocket, which makes no sense unless you have access to various exotic states of consciousness, including meditation, where this becomes more apparent, where you notice kind of the superposition-y quality of consciousness. So from that perspective, actually realizing, stillness and entering and absorbing into the fourth jhana would be finding a configuration of the field where the field looks like it's not moving from many different points of view. In other words, it's kind of like you're solving a puzzle. You're reshaping yourself in such a way that when you perceive your field, it will look perfectly still. And this snowballs and builds up, because if you can actually stabilize some sense of stillness anywhere in the field, then that can kind of like become a seed for further stillness, and stillness grows stillness. And what these Buddhist practitioners say is that there comes a point where the stillness is just constantly following you around, that no matter what is happening in the external world, there is something that is like still inside you, that is kind of a refuge, a source of an escape in a way from the changes of life. I do think, thus, this distinction really matters. Now, equanimity in the sense of Shinzen Young can be really helpful to develop the concentration needed to then experience the stillness of the fourth jhana. But I do think it is a little bit, misleading to try to achieve the fourth jhana using that style of equanimity. I hope this makes sense. If not, drop a question in the comments. And we'll talk on another topic on another time. Thank you for tuning in. Infinite bliss, everybody. Ciao.